Pride Houston Conference 2020. Rights are human. Presenter, Noah Toledo. Transvisible. Transgender rights in Houston, Texas, and the United States. Question. How many people do trans rights affect in the United States? The answer is a lot. Over 1.5 million of us, mostly in the South. Question. How is Houston protecting trans people? Well, former Mayor Annise Parker tried to, remember? Houston's 2015 Proposition 1 even has its own Wikipedia article. Proposition 1 was a referendum held on November 3, 2015 on the anti-discrimination ordinance known as the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, HERO. The ordinance was intended to improve anti-discrimination coverage based on sexual orientation and gender identity in Houston, specifically in areas such as housing and occupation where no anti-discrimination ordinance existed. Proposition 1 asked voters whether they approved HERO. Because the bill would ensure trans residents' ability to use the restroom consistent with their gender expression rather than their biological sex, Houston rejected Prop 1 by a vote of 61 to 39%. Well, that was embarrassing. Fear campaigns by conservative groups convinced the majority of Houston's voters that an equal rights ordinance would cause an increase in crimes in bathrooms, despite the data showing it doesn't. Numerous jurisdictions and states have passed or considered so-called bathroom bills, which restrict the use of bathrooms by trans people, forcing them to use facilities in accordance with their biological sex. This includes Florida, Arizona, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Texas. Question. How many trans people have been convicted of a sexual crime in a public bathroom? The answer is 0. You heard that right. 0. Question. How does this affect transgender youth in school? In 2016, the Departments of Education and Justice issued a letter to schools receiving federal funding that interpreted Title IX protection to apply to gender identity and trans students. It advised schools to use a student's preferred name and pronouns and to allow use of bathrooms and locker rooms of the student's gender identity. Recognition and protection against discrimination is provided by some state and local jurisdictions, but Texas isn't one of them. Question. So how is our great state of Texas protecting trans people? Well, remember the Supreme Court decision we all celebrated in 2015? Yeah. Obergefell versus Hodges established that equal protection requires all jurisdictions to recognize same-sex marriages. That also gave trans people the right to marry regardless of whether their partners are legally their opposite or same sex. In other words, Texas only does what federal law says it has to do, including recognize all marriages. That brings us to this question. Has the federal government tried to specifically protect trans people in any way? Actually, yes. The Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009 added crimes motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability to the federal definition of a hate crime. However, only some states include gender identity in their hate crime laws. Texas is not one of them. Question. What about non-binary people? Is their gender legally recognized? In 2016, Oregon became the first state to legally recognize non-binary people. When a person's gender is not officially recognized, they can seek associated changes, such as their legal name, including on their birth certificate. Now, a few states, such as Massachusetts, have introduced X as a gender option on IDs and driver's licenses. Question. Do trans people have any discrimination protection at work? In 2014, President Barack Obama issued an executive order prohibiting discrimination against trans people in employment by the federal government and its contractors. Question. That's great for federal employees, but what about the rest of us? You might have heard that recently the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in our favor in an amazing way. SCOTUS has only once ruled directly on trans rights, and that was just last month, here in 2020, regarding the applicability of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. SCOTUS held that Title VII protections on sex discrimination in employment extend to transgender employees. That's right, we can no longer be discriminated against at work in the United States. If you lose your job because you're trans, you can now legally fight it in court. Question. That's awesome, but let me guess. Here comes the bad news, right? Unfortunately, yes. You may have recently heard on the news that the Trump administration erased trans civil rights protections in healthcare. The rule finalized by the Department of Health and Human Services means that the federal government no longer recognizes gender identity as an avenue for sex discrimination in healthcare. Question: wait, so we used to have protection in some states against healthcare discrimination? Yes, to a certain extent. Take a look at this map. What do you think it means? Notice all the blue states on the Northeast and on the West Coast and all the red states in the South. It's not a political coincidence. This map shows state by state what the policy is on Medicaid coverage of healthcare related to our gender transition. The blue states are where our medical transition is legally required to be covered by state Medicare, and the red states are where it's legally prohibited to be covered by state Medicare. However, Trump's new policy means we can now be discriminated against in all aspects of our healthcare in any part of the country. This potentially means a doctor or nurse could refuse to treat a trans patient in states where we already have no legal protection from discrimination. Like right here in Texas. Remember this map I showed you at the very beginning of this video? Most transgender people live in southern states, in politically conservative states. As of right now, we are no longer federally protected against any form of healthcare discrimination in any state of the Union during a pandemic. My question for you is, what will you do to fight for transgender rights?